Dell Rose, welcome to Crosshatched.
Thank you so very much.
You are like the boss level guest. I didn't think I deserved to interview you yet, but it was so important for us to talk early in the series. Thank you for being with me. You've talked about Paul in some of your previous speaking engagements. Wasn't it a 5-part series at the Chicago Library?
So it started out as a we had this idea that it was going to be a 5-part series. By the time that we ended, something like 12 videos
Oh my
about the
gosh.
Apostle Paul and
Well,
understanding him.
so, um, couple more questions about that. Then I'm going to ask about your background, and then we're going to come back into that. Um, so I understand that Paul wrote about 25% of the Bible, right?
In the New Testament, it's actually a little bit higher than that. He wrote, or what has been attributed to Paul
Uh-huh.
is in the New Testament around 50%, a little
Right.
less than 50. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So, um, right. So we're supposed to take on faith, as it were, that this guy Paul's account is accurate and true. And Paul is going to put a great deal of emphasis on faith that will shape how some Christians market their religion. Um,
Mhm.
and I sometimes wonder how much of this is responsible for declining church attendance. But before we go into that, let me get into your background. When did you move to Chicago?
So we moved here last year. Um, I've I've
Oh,
I've only been here for a year. But yeah, we're loving the city. It's great. And we moved from Europe, and I mean, the first day I got here, and I met Karen, it was like, okay, yeah, this is where we're meant to be. And I've never doubted that since.
Karen's your partner?
Karen is the director of the Swedenborg Library. No, my
Oh, yes,
partner is
that's
in.
right.
Yeah, my
Right.
partner his name's Quinn.
Okay, okay. Um, yes, that's right. Isn't Karen about to retire?
Um, so I have told her that she cannot retire, and that we're actually building a life preservation tank in the back so
Good.
she can continue to do all of the functions.
Wonderful.
There is
Yes.
no. Karen is one of these people who can do everything.
Yeah,
And
that's my understanding. Mhm.
she's considerably, she's much older than I am. She understands a computer far better. She has this very practical way of looking at the world that is just completely alien to me.
Uh-huh.
So I hope she never retires. I hope we get to. And I told her, I said, "You better not die. I'll find Frankenstein and resurrect you."
Yes. Yeah, I'm right there with you. I hear she has amazing capabilities.
She's a former businesswoman, so she just has this way of assessing things in a way that really sort of gets you down to brass tacks very quickly.
Mhm.
And I appreciated that so much about her, is that she'll
Yeah,
see something, she'll be like, okay, well, who's this market for? What are you
yeah.
trying to say here? And
Right.
for
Right.
me, that's very alien to the way I
Right.
think.
Yes, but very important. Yeah.
Incredibly important. We don't need. I think that one of the issues with Swedenborgians are we are very intellectual,
Mhm.
but that gets in the way of, I think, of our effectiveness in some cases,
Mm.
because we need the theologians, we need the Emersons, we need the Whitmans, the Blakes, but we also need someone who's watching the money. We need someone who's sort of aggressive on asking hard questions about outreach. We need someone who's asking uh,
Yeah.
the difficult things.
Mm.
And I really respect Karen in the work that she's done in the church, because she's always
Yeah.
bringing up those issues.
Yeah.
How are we reaching out?
Right.
How are
Right.
we inspiring something greater than ourselves? And she kept. I mean, were it not for Karen, the library would have probably gone down.
Right.
And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
this is her lifelong commitment. to
Mm,
ensure that Swedenborgianism, which had such an illustrious history here in the city of Chicago,
yeah.
would always have a representation here.
How
And
long ago did you discover Swedenborg? You didn't grow up Swedenborgian.
no, I grew up actually in a very secular household,
Mm.
between Judaism and Christianity, but
Oh,
very, 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 very secular. My family, I mean, there was this sort of vague notion of a god, but not really a great deal other than that. And
right.
we never went to any religious service. I mean, we celebrated Christmas and that sort of thing, but these were not religious. These weren't imbued with religious meaning.
Yeah,
Um,
right, right.
no one read the Bible to me. I didn't grow
Uh-huh.
up with that. But it also wasn't a place where my family home wasn't a place where religion was scorned. It was just that
Sure.
it wasn't necessarily something that held our attention all the time.
Right, yeah, yeah. Was there something that sparked your interest in the spiritual world, life after death, like a
When I was
an
13, and oh no, actually, this is when I was no, I was 12 at the time. I was reading William Blake, and in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he makes this statement where he says, Swedenborg is um, Swedenborg is the linen folded up, meaning from the body of Jesus. That his teachings only covered the body of Jesus, and now he is put away. And all I could think is, who is this Swedenborg? Who is this person? I'd never
Yeah,
heard of him before.
yeah.
I, you know, I'd never heard of the name. I'd never heard of the Church of the New Jerusalem. I'd never heard of any of this. I looked him up in an encyclopedia, actually,
Uh-huh.
and I started reading about him. And then it started a passion in terms of reading. So I would look through
Mm,
books and I would go, okay,
mm.
Swedenborg topic. And then I would turn there.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
I discovered, at that time I was not even familiar with the distinctions between the new church and the general convention.
Uh-huh, yeah.
And so my first actual
Mm,
Swedenborgian contact was with the Reverend Don Rose, who was in
okay.
Brynathan, and I called him one day. I phoned the cathedral and I asked. I said, "Hi, I would like to speak to the minister." And she said, "What's your name?" And I said, "My name is Dell Rose." And she goes, "Oh, are you related? Because his name is Don Rose."
Right,
And
yeah.
I thought, "I don't think we're related." But we had about a 45-minute discussion, and for a period of about 10 years we wrote back and forth to each other,
Oh,
and he
wow.
would give me all of these tidbits from Swedenborg. And my journey to faith is actually, um I don't know that I think we put a lot of emphasis on this idea that at some point we worked out in our minds the question of faith, or we put our faith in something. And I don't think it's the case at all. I think you find yourself believing. and
Hmm.
and as I kept reading, so the first book I read was Divine Providence, and it was almost this if statement. It was like comparative literature. If this is true, this would be really, really beautiful.
Right.
But then as I continued to engage and engage and engage in what Swedenborg is saying, um I remember having this conversation with someone, and I said, "Our church," and then it stopped me.
Uh-huh.
Our church, whose church? And that was probably the first of many. And then, not to be in a sad way, but Swedenborg's writings have become, in many ways, a bastion of strength for me from some of the most difficult times. When my
Mm.
partner's mother died in one of the worst ways imaginable, she was murdered by arson.
Oh,
I found I in those moments I really question where I would be were it not for the assurance that Swedenborg gives us that the
yeah.
transitions that are the hardest are the least.
Mm.
The fact that someone can go through something so terrible, but you know that when they awake in the next world, they're not awaking to terror.
Yeah.
They're awaking. to the mercy of the Lord, and
Yeah.
it's so gentle
Hmm.
and so precious. And that to me was that was mother's milk.
Hmm.
I clung to that, and I remember reading when she first died. I read through the entire NCE of the NCE edition of Heaven and Hell
Hmm.
because I just wanted to hear again. Okay, you needn't worry about this.
That was the
And
first one I read. I think it was the 1899 edition of Heaven and Hell.
oh wow,
And
yeah,
yeah, similar to you, no, I wasn't born in the church. I saw a quote from Swedenborg and I thought, oh, this sounds interesting. And it was several years until I knew that there was a church.
yeah. Same here. Yeah, I didn't know because Swedenborg was actually quite specific about. Let's just say he was concerned about institutions.
Yeah.
Um, there's no saving gnosis in Swedenborg.
Okay.
Swedenborg says, okay, well, there's no knowledge that's going to save you.
Hmm.
The only thing that's going to save you is your entirety, your interiority, and your spirituality are the same. It's not meaning we're not making issues, we're not making problems, we don't have sin, etc. Swedenborg actually is very clear that we do all of those things,
Hmm.
but it's that progress to try to find what ruling love connects with you,
Yes.
and whether or not that reveals the face of Jesus or takes away from it.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
there's no easy answer. There's no Lord Jesus, forgive me, I'm a sinner. Come into my heart, amen. There's no last rites. There's none of these things that's going to give you this assertiveness that in spite of whoever you are, now you'll get it.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yes, you'll say Namo Amida Butsu and you're going to go to the Pure Land. No, there is there is nothing in Swedenborg's writings. I always say that it's the easiest thing in the world to go to heaven. It just takes everything you are,
Yeah.
and um, and I really mean that there is an issue with in Swedenborg the interiority and the exteriority must meet.
Mm.
Mm, and that's always a difficult process. And I always think that although the Swedenborgian Church has this reputation of being Pollyanna, everything goes blah blah blah. In
Mm.
reality, when you read him, he's unbelievably um, he's very concerned with human psychology and humanity's ability to deceive itself.
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah. Yeah. um like he does point out about how, well, if you may act in a nice and civil way, but if your interiors are to the contrary and you're only refraining from those bad acts because of your reputation, then you're really not cut out for the heavenly life either.
exactly. Yeah, you
Hmm.
exactly that. Yeah, and this wonderful the reality that you know, we do not enter heaven. We live in heaven. We reflect the joys of heaven. We embody, we're sort of citizens of heaven. And then we die, and then we go to heaven. But
Oh,
but this idea that everything in this world is bad and then you're going to die and it's all going to be good. Swedenborg says no, the process has to start here. And I often say this to people, who come from traditions that are very world rejecting. Say, yes, you can reject the terrible things about the world, but you must learn to love the mercy and vision that we find here, because that's the only thing that leads to the next world. And
mm,
the only way to really, I don't even like the word escape, but the only way to transcend a lot of the limitations here is to find the inner love that exists with them and
yeah,
to mirror that back.
yeah, yeah.
And it's but it is a constant refining. And
Mm.
you know
That's very, yeah, very important. So
and we always have to, yeah, go ahead, Tim.
fairly while I'm fairly well read on Swedenborg, I'm by no means a theologian, right? I've only read the New Testament once. So my ignorance is gonna show a lot in this conversation, but I think
Totally.
it's
Yeah,
I think it's good
totally.
for I think a lot of listeners might have the same questions that I do. So
Exactly.
I want to start with some basics about this guy Paul, right?
Yeah,
So
sure.
he didn't live in Jesus' time. He was what 100 years later, or when?
So Paul is he's roughly a contemporary of Jesus.
Oh,
Um, so um, based on calculations of the crucifixion being in the year 33 AD, he would have probably converted somewhere in that period. But I think you, what I think you're tapping into is the fact that Paul's writings themselves,
uh huh.
they go through stages of greater and lesser authority. And really, about 150 years after the death of Jesus, Paul's vision of the gospel really becomes dominant in the developing church.
Okay.
And but this was also, and this is why I think Paul is so fascinating, because he's actually contradicting and in some cases seeking to instruct
Hmm.
the people who knew Jesus, particularly the leaders of the Jerusalem church, James the Just, even Peter, the chosen successor of Jesus. There are moments where he actually seeks to instruct them, and the book of Acts shows that. Um,
Is Paul mentioned in the Bible?
oh yeah, well he's one of the first modern people. Yeah, so he's
Okay.
always writing from a singular I,
Okay.
and his Gospel to the Romans, um that's really where you can see the individual thinker trying to understand the Christ event.
Right.
And
Did he have a
his
last name? Do we know his last name?
no in the period, most people would not have what we would call a family name.
Huh.
Most people would only have, well, as Abram, Isaac, and Jacob.
Right.
And this is the case today in Judaism, where someone's name is Moshe bin Aaron bin, you know, that was how people related. And the notion of having a family name, yeah, that's not really something that came about until well into in modernity. And even, for instance, in the Islamic world, until
Mm.
fairly recently, people did not have family names. They had
Are there
direct.
any visual depictions of Paul, like paintings? Do they have any consistency?
There are the earliest one. There is a picture of someone we're assuming to be Paul.
Huh.
And I'm actually forgetting where it is, but it's about 200 years after Paul's death.
Uh-huh.
That he's depicted. I think it's actually in Syria, maybe.
Hmm. Hmm.
It could be in Antioch, but that's one of the earliest depictions of Paul.
Okay.
And what's really, really important, that again, I just wanted to stress, that in this period, Paul's voice is not the only person arguing for what the Christ event is. You have adoptionists. There are hundreds of different interpretations. Um, and even this notion that, truthfully, you can't talk about early Christians, because the early Christians would have seen themselves as Jewish or Jewish adjacent. And this notion, which Paul brings out, um, of a very clear and fast distinction between Jews and non-Jews, I think that simplifies a very, very, very
Mhm.
complex situation.
Right.
Um, Early on in Judaism, for instance, one became a follower of Judaism by sort of being accepted by the community. Communities had different standards. After the destruction of the Second Temple and the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century, um, these ideas become sort of rarefied in a particular sect of law followers, which we later call the Pharisees.
Right.
Um, and they had very specific ideas about what it means to be a Jew in terms of family lineage, conversion, acceptance, etc. And that's really what Paul's engaging with. But
Hmm.
I don't believe, truthfully, and this is one of the things that I've tried very hard to argue, I don't believe really that Paul was ever truthfully a Pharisee. there are stories in the New Testament where he is called a disciple of Gamaliel.
Uh-huh.
Gamaliel, I I mean, that would be the equivalent of just picking some famous person from the first century. It'd be the equivalent of saying that someone today is a disciple of Eckhart Tolle. Now, of course, you don't have to know a great deal, or Eckhart Tolle. You don't have to know a great deal about his teachings, but you can recognize the name. And Gamaliel is very important in the formation of what we would call Rabbinic Judaism, which is roughly the same time that
Mhm.
Christianity is being formed. And they're actually disagreeing with each other quite profoundly. And so I think Paul uses the language of Pharisaism. He uses the language of the law um, in a very unique and idiosyncratic way, which has sort of an origin in early Pharisaism, but is also very different than the
Mm.
type of teachings that they are encouraging. And so Paul really he has the unfortunate reality of defining two traditions. He defines Christianity and inadvertently he defines Judaism. And I
Huh.
think for a much poorer reality, because the lived versions of these traditions was very different.
Mm.
The whole notion that Paul is writing to Christians. You can see in the book of Acts that Christians have not entirely worked out that they're a different group yet. And that
Oh.
really doesn't happen until the 3rd century. Um, yeah.
So coming back a bit now, I don't know if this is controversial. I just saw this online a few days ago, and
Sure.
somebody was saying that like before Paul had this great revelation that he was out killing Christians and then Jesus blinded him or something. Is this
Uh,
a controversial statement or is this largely believed and
well,
um
that's how he presented himself. And the interesting thing about that is, so yes, well, there's three versions of the account.
okay.
In one, he's attended by a Christian who lives in the vicinity, and he's cared for I think it's a month. In another version, he's stricken blind, and there doesn't seem to be anything going on. If you want to put it on your website, I have a sheet that breaks down the differences in the conversion accounts. But basically, that story is doing something very important rhetorically, and here it is. There needs to be some kind of dramatic conversion to justify his claim to be an apostle. And in the 1st century, in the period in which we're talking, an apostle is simply someone who has seen Jesus.
Mhm.
And Paul makes the statement that he has seen Jesus
Mhm.
by his encounter, and he's actually incredibly um, concerned with justifying himself as an apostle. Do
Yeah.
you not call me an apostle also? Have I not seen Jesus? He says.
Mhm.
And this story, which I think each of those reiterations really shows the time period, and the sort of accumulative perspective of the book of Luke and the book of Acts, they're from the same author, strongly indebted to Paul, and is strongly indebted to showing Paul's authority to speak. This is always the question in 1st century. On whose authority are you speaking? And Paul very quickly uses his mystical experience as a way to justify his apostolic claims.
Right.
And
Yes.
so, what better way to do that than to present someone who is at one time the complete antithesis of Christians, a Pharisee, although that, although a lot of that is looking backwards and renaming what may have been very different during the time period. But he's looking back, he's seeing they're claiming his tradition of being a Pharisee as someone educated in the highest echelons of Jewish society,
Mm.
and someone who embodied a tradition which was fiercely opposed to Christians. I also don't think that's the case. They probably wouldn't have known about them, truthfully. Certainly Gamaliel, I don't think ever knew about Christianity. Again, that's not a term that they would have used. And so this later story presents him as a Pharisee, the opposite of a Christian, and he has this revelation. He sees God. He's been entirely changed on the road to Damascus, and now he feels empowered to speak on
So do you
behalf.
question the veracity of the statement that he previously was killing
I
Christians?
I don't think so. No, yeah, I do
You don't
question
think
the
so?
statement. Um, Part of it really comes from the fact that Paul, during this time period, I mean, I'm not saying that there weren't any early martyrdoms of some of the early followers, but really that's a phenomenon much more important in the first 150 years onward. At this time, and I think it's very important to remember that we are talking about a period in which identities are just now forming.
Mhm.
And as Paul continues to go to the temple, that shows that most Jews, and in fact, the people that he's arguing against, the people who are Judaizers, people who insist on keeping some aspects of the law to become Christians. So there's not really that distinction yet. And
Hmm.
I really don't think it would have roused a particular interest amongst the Pharisaic sects because they were always arguing against different messianic claimants. There was always a plethora of people claiming to be messiahs.
Hmm, hmm,
Um,
hmm.
so I don't think that certainly not in the time period, because we also have to remember that Paul was almost converted within the same year that Jesus died, which leads me to believe, one, that if there would have been previous murders of Christians since Stephen, etc., that this would have, one, that's not going to be the case because they wouldn't have known about the followers of Jesus at that point. So that's very clearly, in my mind, a later formulation.
Mhm.
And secondly, you can find it in the way the rhetoric is formed, because Paul is presented not as someone who actively participated in the murder, but someone who assented, who helped. Someone sort of like he held their coats, which is moving him one degree of wickedness down. But I think this
Slightly,
is,
right, yeah. I was
yeah.
gonna ask, like, was did he have some sort of militia or was there torture involved? Because really, whether or not they were Christians is almost beside the point. It's quite shocking to suggest that the guy who wrote half of the New Testament was involved in cold-blooded murder.
Yeah,
And it almost explains like, oh, I could see how somebody with that past would really latch on to faith as the real thing that matters, right? Like I could see somebody with that having so much, guilt perhaps of being involved in murder that they would it would be really nice for them to believe, oh, you know what? Salvation is really just about believing in Jesus. It's not that I've got murder in my heart and blood on my hands. It's because I believe that this guy is the Messiah.
well, and he does. So I wouldn't even say that, to that effect, really, because I think that this entire story about him assenting to the death of Stephen, actively involved in the persecution of the Christians, I don't believe any of that happened. I think that is reflecting a world probably in the middle part of the first century. So one, you start having official Roman Empire persecution. There is a consciousness now about the sect of the Christians amongst previously Jewish, and this is also a very important thing to remember, that there were a lot of pagan monotheists and people who were inspired by Judaism but were not themselves Jews, or they evaluated some of the different philosophies. Stoicism is a very common one. But no, I don't think anything that Paul, I think that that's the manufactured part. I think that is the part that justifies, hey, this guy was so wicked, and
Mhm,
then Jesus saved him by this encounter, and
mhm,
he was completely metamorphosized.
right,
I don't think so. So first of all, I don't believe Paul was a Pharisee.
mm,
I think that really there's very little of the type of legalistic analysis that that the movement that we would later call Pharisees, I always refer to pietistic law followers instead of saying Pharisee, because Pharisee is a much later term, and it sort of puts a lot of people together. But so there's all these different traditions of Judaism. Paul was from Tarsus, which was a city of high messianic fervor. It was a city that very quickly sort of embraced the Second Temple apocalyptic literature.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is where Paul starts. And he probably, I mean, I think before maybe, this is all speculation, by the way, I don't know this,
Sure.
but he seems to already be very taken with the theological implication of a Messiah. I think that at some point he heard, maybe through his journeys to Jerusalem, because remember this was commanded and lots of Jews did this, but we shouldn't, it was part vacation, part holy day, part something you should do, part cultural event. Then there was a lot of impetus to go. And I think that maybe he heard about the Jesus movement very early on, and he started expanding on ideas that he already had, that he'd taken from apocalyptic Judaism, and then he applies it to the Jesus movement. And he's remarkably successful. And part of his success is because he sort of breaks down in very sophisticated ways. I do not think Paul was definitely one of the most brilliant people alive, but he
Did he
breaks
form a
down.
church? Did he have a bunch of followers?
We know that he had some,
Mhm.
and he was taken to be a voice of authority. But by the way, all of the letters that we have, those aren't random theological treatises. He's writing those to people,
Right.
and he's writing to people that he has already been involved with, that
Mhm.
he's already come into contact with, and who at least initially shared his viewpoints. And part of his letters are constantly reminding people to come back to his formulation of the Christ event. And you see this throughout. In Corinthians, he's talking about, those who say, well, there's no need to follow any laws. He talks against the Judaizers. In the book of Acts, he actually talks against St. Peter. He talks against, the chosen apostle. And he becomes sort of a teacher of the right way. And that was, of course, not well received by many, particularly in the Jerusalem church,
Uh-huh.
some of whom were blood relatives of Jesus, James the Just, the brother of
Mm.
Jesus, who did not acknowledge Paul's sovereignty. And he's always fighting this battle for, why is my version the only one that's correct? He actually says that people who do not share his view should be anathemized, which anathema means to be cut off entirely. I think that part of that came from the fact that any variation in his own ideology would mean that his apostolic authority was not at the same level.
Oh.
And this is
Ah.
why I think that, he was so insistent on his view. But
And what do you think was maybe the driving force then? Because he's responsible for the emphasis on atonement or salvation through faith alone, right? He's a big driving force behind this idea, correct?
uh, well, the notion of faith alone, which the way that you're describing it there is already showing how that's come to us. Because this is a Protestant, that faith alone is a translation of the Latin phrase sola fide.
Hmm.
And this is one of the 5 solas that the Protestant movement was based on. And yes, that explicitly comes from the writings of Paul. And it comes from the way that he's discussing how one becomes a participant in the body of Christ.
Uh-huh.
I probably should have prefaced all of this by saying that not all of the writings of Paul are actually written by Paul. This is in Greek translation, it's called pseudo-epigrapha, and it means writing under the name of someone else.
Huh.
And we would tend to see it as sort of like lying or being dishonest. That's not really how it was seen in the first century.
Mm.
So for instance, Origen is very quick. Origen, one of the church fathers, is very quick to say that, he doesn't think that Paul wrote everything, but that doesn't mean that he didn't acknowledge the truth that was held within the writings.
Right.
And very often, if you wanted to show your allegiance to a particular thinker, you would write in their name. And
Oh. Huh.
so that's going on as well. But in Paul's actual writings, the confirmed writings, if you want to say,
Yeah.
yeah, he's intensely interested in this question.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. And sometimes I think that there's this almost cultish marketing advantage that when you tell people, "Oh, you believe in this thing and you'll be in our little group." Like I had some friends in high school who got sucked into a cult, and it wasn't like really hyper Christian oriented, but it was definitely a cult. And whenever, somebody was starting to, kind of question things, it was almost this soothing, "Oh, you're doubting, it's okay. You're just doubting." It's kind of demonizing doubt and saying like, "Oh, you just have to push this doubt away and have faith, and then you'll feel good again in this group." Um, do you have any thoughts on why he put this emphasis here? And maybe I'll do a follow-up is why did anybody ever question or come at it and saying, why can't you decide to believe in Jesus after death? Like, why can't you have a coming to Jesus moment on the other side? What did he ever write something that was very explicit in saying, absolutely not. The moment you die, it is too late. You have to believe in Jesus while you're on this earth.
well, so these are very good questions. Um, and I'll start by answering the second one first.
Okay.
Um, that there is an issue in the history of early Christianity between the notion of an imminent spiritual world and the belief in resurrection. So resurrection, for instance, was you will die, something will happen to your soul. Either it goes to sleep, it goes to the bosom of Abraham, it dissolves. I mean, there's all kinds of theories about it's reincarnated. These were all ideas in first century Judaism. Um, and Paul assumes two things. So at some writings, he is writing to people who still share a belief in resurrection, not necessarily in eternal life, or not necessarily in unmediated eternal life. But there are other passages which may reflect later developments in Christianity. The one I'm thinking of, I can't remember the verse exactly, but it says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And this idea gradually took to being more acceptable to first century Christians, but who also combined it with the idea that if you were in heaven, there's no end of the the restoration will happen, the resurrection will happen, but you are also in heaven. Well, there is this sort of idea that Paul has, which has well, not just has some, but I mean it's pretty rooted in a lot of Palestinian Jewish conceptions and apocalyptic conceptions about the nature of life, life being the physical life, that once you die, your ability to influence or to participate in spiritual life is forever changed.
Hmm. Hmm.
So in the very old, I mean, well, we don't really have anything reliable about this particular concept, I would say before the 6th century. But Sheol, the place of darkness, is a very unique underworld, and it's some place. It's often described as a land of shades. It's very dark. People forget their names, they forget their memories. They're sort of miserable, and they just exist. And there is a lot of writing about that there is no escape from Sheol, and you're tied down. Your life is, your existence is forever, but it's always in memory or in longing for the physical world. And Paul sort of brings the same logic in. Well, what is the point of the body if it's not to make a decision? What is the
Huh.
point of the body if it's not to, you are learning things here in the flesh, fallen things, but this is where your redemption has to start. And if it doesn't start here, there is no forgiveness.
Right.
And that's also much more of an apocalyptic idea than, truthfully, a Pharisaic idea. For instance, Pharisees and Sadducees, sometimes they believed that the world would be entirely set aright, sometimes they didn't. And we can find this from legal discussions about the nature of sin and the reason why God allows it, etc. That there are people who will say, well, there will be sin until the resurrection. And, at the resurrection, everybody will be resurrected. Later on, only the righteous will be resurrected. I mean, there's entirely various ideas about what this looks like. But yeah, the sort of linchpin for Mediterranean Jewish thought was it had to occur in the body.
Right.
And
Right.
and this was a similar position. It's based a lot on Greek depictions about the afterlife, where in the next world, you may not, the first thing that sort of goes is your ability to think. And in Greek mystery cults, for instance, which is some of the oldest Greek writing we have, in Greek mystery cults, you're always being incited to remember, and they're giving you precise instructions. Turn left, go to this tree, don't drink from this fountain, go here, demand of the gods, demand of the guardians this, say this password, etc. But that's all predicated on the fact that if you did not have that knowledge now, you would not be able to figure that out in the next world.
Huh.
And all just carries that sort of cultural reasoning into his own understanding of the body.
Yeah, it's such a crucial distinction that I think the faith alone folks hang on to, but is frequently contradicted by the near death experience testimonials.
Experience always contradicts ideas. That's why people are always much more careful. You respect, in a certain ways, more a philosophical conception, something that limits experience,
Hmm.
because experience is myriad. And what that would suggest to me is that maybe we shouldn't take the people who are saying, you know, these things with such, absolute devotion, but we should, in fact, question their abilities to make such statements. And by the way, I mean, again, I don't think that either the writings in the 6th century onwards, they're not assuming the same kind of hell that we are today. Dante, and apocalyptic literature, post-Second Temple literature, all the stuff that's coming out in the 1st century, these journeys to the afterlife and seeing the darkness there, these all had an effect. But, you find in Psalms this really hopeful stage. It says, yea, even if I go down to the pit, there you are also. You
Hmm.
know, and for me at any rate, that was a very encouraging, statement.